Good evening. I was originally planning to dedicate this episode to the Paris Commune of 1871. However, as I began assembling the various parts of the video, I realized that just describing the Commune without the background would not help explain the how and the why of that short, unfortunate, but important episode. Therefore, I thought it might be of interest to review what happened in France after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815. And because contributing to history are an immense number of people and events, we can at best only retain some essential. In the case at hand, relatively few, I think, realize or remember that between 1815 and 1871, France saw three different kings, three revolutions, one short-lived republic, one empire, one commune that we can call with much license a People's Republic, and finally a French Republic, essentially similar to the French Republic of today. But let us go in order. In 1814, 1 year before the conclusive and mythical Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon resigned. This followed the disastrous Russia campaign in 1812 and his defeat against the European allies of the time, meaning Austria, Prussia, Russia and Sweden. His defeat at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. After his resignation, he went to live in the island of Elba, retaining the title of emperor, this time, however, only emperor of the 12,000 inhabitants of that pleasant island. France, or rather, the royalist party that included all the émigrés that left France during the Revolution and the allies that had defeated Napoleon, and note that this was before Waterloo in 1815, all these allies put back on the throne, yes, a Bourbon, namely the brother of the guillotined Louis XVI, the new king being namely Louis XVIII, who had been in exile and sometimes almost in poverty for 23 years. This time the monarchy was constitutional, and its rules were established by an important historic document called the Charter, or Charte constitutionnelle. More or less we can say that the Charter was the equivalent of our Bill of Rights. In imitation of the British model, the Charter of 1814 established a bicameral legislature consisting of a Chamber of Deputies and the Chamber of Peers. The Chamber of Deputies was elected. The Chamber of Peers was appointed by the king. Even so, and we cannot really go into details, it was a constitutional but not a parliamentary monarchy, in the sense that the king had a large share of power in the decision-making process. But Napoleon managed to return to France from Elba and regain his Emperor of France title for the famous 100 days from March 1815 to July 1815, after which he tried his luck once more at the Battle of Waterloo, was defeated and exiled to the island of St. Helena or St. Helena in the middle of the South Atlantic, where he died in 1821. The European powers met again in the famous Congress of Vienna, which now turned out to be a kind, if you like, of Bilderberg group before its time. In France, a mood of restoration, we could say, was in the air after 25 years of revolution, despair, triumph and tragedy. Restoration, of course, meant restoring the monarchy and the provisional government of Paris, called in, as I said before, Louis XVIII. Remember that Louis XVI had been executed in 1792 when the revolution was gradually sinking into terror. You may ask, why not? Or rather, what happened to Louis XVII? There was indeed a Louis XVII, son of Louis XVI and of Marie Antoinette, but after the execution of his parents, he was essentially a prisoner in the same temple, where his father was also imprisoned before being executed. Louis XVII died in 1795 at the age of 10 of tuberculosis. The doctor was appalled to see the scars of what was only a boy. Anyway, this is why the next king after the Restoration was Louis XVIII and not Louis XVII. Louis XVIII accepted all the conditions that the ex-revolutionaries asked except the tricolor cockade worn as a symbol of the revolution. Louis XVIII was on the whole a peaceful king. What complicated his reign and made it difficult, very difficult, were the émigrés who had left France 20 years before and who now came back and wanted vengeance, especially vengeance against the ex-general of Napoleon. Besides, they wanted all their properties and privileges back, and it seemed that the revolutionary tribunal had returned, but now manned or staffed by the returning exiles. They got their satisfaction in condemning to death one of the most heroic generals of Napoleon, Marshal Ney. There were attempts to reconcile the monarchy with the changes brought about by the revolution, but it was difficult. The officers on half pay regretted the Emperor Napoleon, and on the other hand, the people and the bourgeoisie wanted to preserve the social equality established by the revolution. King Louis XVIII was trying to be conciliatory, but the royalists were more royalist than the king himself. Then, in 1820, a terrorist, as we would call him today, a Mr. Louvel, assassinated the Duc de Berry, who was a nephew of the king and a great hope of the ultras. This caused more upheavals, harshness, and executions. Still, some success in yet another foreign intervention by France in Spain to quell a revolution against the King of Spain helped keep the political situation under control until Louis XVIII died in 1824. The new king, King number 2 after the French Revolution, was the Count of Artois, who took the name of Charles X. He was the uncle of the uncrowned Louis XVII, whom I mentioned before, and the younger brother of the executed King Louis XVI and of King Louis XVIII, of whom we just spoke. But whereas Louis XVIII was a moderate of the old regime and we could say a free thinker, Charles X was an émigré and a bigot to the point of scaring even the royalists. A billion francs indemnity granted to émigrés whose property had been confiscated by the revolution annoyed the majority of the nation. Soon there was censure of the press. All revolution, we could say, have many causes. Mentioning some and not others represents an injustice to history. Here, for the 1830 July Revolution, I will mention but two: the imposition of the death penalty for anyone profaning the Eucharist, which was called the Anti-Sacrilege Act, and the provision for financial indemnities for properties confiscated by the 1789 Revolution and during the First Empire of Napoleon. These indemnities to be paid to anyone, whether noble or non-noble, who had been declared enemies of the revolution. This was fine, except that the king had no armed forces to back him up in his illegal measures, and he had forgotten that times had changed, and he too was now a constitutional and no longer an absolute king. But, as we know, imagination is the mistress of illusions, and Charles X thought he had more power than he actually did. When the chamber met and expressed to the king the anxiety of the nation at the repressive measures, the king answered by dissolving the chamber, which in effect also meant cancelling the charter agreed upon by all the participants to the Congress of Vienna during 1814-1815. In this cartoon of the time, Charles X attempts to break a billiard ball marked Charter with his teeth, but finds the nut too hard to crack. When, at the next elections, the opposition, let's call it the left, and the party of the émigrés, let's call it the right, the opposition, that is, the opposition, the left, won, he could have saved his throne by changing ministers. But Charles X did not believe in parliamentary debates and delays. He said, Louis XVI was lost through concessions. I have but one choice, to drive or be driven. And so it came to pass that another revolution came about, referred to as the Three Glorious Days of France, from July 27 to July 29 of 1830. The Tuileries Palace was sacked. Overall, however, the damage was small. The Louvre fell as well, but the damage and looting, as I said, were contained. The crowd actually protected the paintings, and the Swiss Guard, seeing the mob swarming towards them and ordered not to fire unless fired upon, they decided to run away. But they had no wish to share the fate of a similar contingent of Swiss Guards back in 1789, who had held their ground against another such mob and were killed all and torn to pieces. Those who know Paris may have walked through the Place de la Bastille. The famous Bastille, that was the spark of the 1789 French Revolution, is no longer there. There had been an intent to raise a statue of a huge elephant to commemorate the event, but only a full-scale model was erected, and this is what it should have looked like. The plaster model was eventually removed, but the same base was used to erect a column that is there today to commemorate the Three Glorious Days of 1830. It was inaugurated by the next King of France, or King of the French, as he decided to call himself, under whom we will speak next. The Revolution of 1830 created again a constitutional monarchy, and on August 2nd of 1830, Charles X and his son, the Dauphin, or the Dauphin, abdicated their rights to the throne and left for England. Although Charles X had intended that his grandson, the Duke of Bordeaux, would take the throne as Henry V, the politicians who composed the provisional government instead placed on the throne a distant cousin, the Duke of Orléans, belonging to the house of the same name, Orléans, who agreed to rule as a constitutional monarch. And this period became known as the July Monarchy, supported of the exiled senior line of the Bourbon dynasty became known as Legitimists. The new king called himself Louis Philippe I, and there is an abundance of Louis among the kings of France, starting from Louis I, called the Pious, who lived and reigned in the 9th century, and of whom we spoke in the episode of the historical sketches dedicated to Charlemagne. Louis Philippe decided to call himself, instead of King of France, King of the French, intended this to be a symbolic gesture to the rioters who wanted or who grieved for the revolution of 1789 and for other rioters who grieved for Napoleon's empire. But he did not displease completely the revolutionaries, because he came from the Orléans family who had participated in the original 1789 revolution against Louis XVI. And he fought in the battle, also Louis Philippe fought in the Battle of Valmy of 20 September 1792, the first battle won by the revolutionaries against the Prussians. Louis Philippe called workmen "my friends" and the National Guardsmen "my comrades." When citizens gathered beneath his window and called out his name, he would appear on a balcony brandishing the tricolor French flag and singing the Marseillaise. He wanted, or turned out to be, the king of the middle class, which you may think was possibly the most desirable option, considering the turmoil of France's recent history. But Louis XVIII was soon to become the target of his enemies, aggravated by negative external factors a widespread outbreak of cholera, which killed over 18,000 people just in Paris. There were harvest failures, food shortages, and increases in the cost of living. Against him were the Republicans, who had caused the three glorious days of 1830 revolution, of which I just spoke. There were Parisian workers and students reinforced by Polish, Italian, and German refugees. These refugees who had fled to Paris after the crackdown on the Republican and nationalist activities in their respective countries. The spark for the second June 1832 revolution was the crowd gathering at the funeral of the Napoleonic War hero and reformer Jean-Maximilien Lamarck, who actually died of cholera. At one point during the funeral, a red flag appeared bearing the words "La liberté ou la mort," liberty or death. The crowd broke into disorder and shots were exchanged with government troops. This insurrection lasted 2 days. There were 800 victims, but the government succeeded in gaining the upper hand with the army and the National Guard. The government, which had come to power in a revolution, now distanced itself from its own revolutionary past, famously removing from view Delacroix painting "Liberty Leading the People," which had been commissioned to commemorate the events of the three glorious days of 1830. We can perhaps agree that history is never consistent. In one of those conjunctions between history and literature to make famous the June 1832 rebellion was the French writer Victor Hugo with his novel Les Misérables, because when the riot started he was writing a play and he was sitting in the Tuileries Gardens, and soon later he was taking shelter from bullets coming from both sides. The novel begins in 1815, the year of Napoleon Bonaparte's final defeat at Waterloo, and describes the battles of the 1832 June Rebellion. Hugo was a Republican activist and favored the revolutionaries, but in Les Misérables he wrote about Louis Philippe in sympathetic terms. Louis Philippe was an interesting character and a lover of good cuisine. He had been in exile for a long time, notably in England. He was what we call undiplomatically a glutton, or more diplomatically a gourmand. The satirical press associated him with the image of a pear, and he acquired the nickname of Philippon, meaning the Big Philip. During his reign there was a rapprochement, as it is said in diplomatic language, a sort of reconciliation between England and France. At one point, the Prime Minister of England, Disraeli, made a formal visit to Paris, and during a formal dinner, part of the menu consisted of a ham, and Louis Philippe, the king, started slicing the ham for Disraeli in his plate, at which Disraeli said diplomatically, "Your Majesty, I cannot allow this," meaning slicing the ham and serving Disraeli. No, said Louis Philippe, "I learned how to do this in a restaurant when I was in exile in London, and the chef showed me how to slice the ham in the thinnest possible slices." Still, though possibly the most amiable and congenial of the three kings that followed the defeat of Napoleon, the climate was changing and deteriorating, and it was not necessarily the fault of the king. Let's examine these factors in sequence and not necessarily in order of importance, but all contributing to the malaise of the time. We should remember that by 1830 Europe was well engaged into the Industrial Revolution. In general, with social, cultural movements affecting all society at large, literature, I think, does a better job to convey the spirit and the state of being of the time. Charles Dickens perfectly conveyed what life was in London when England was at the peak of her empire, when 3/4 of the world map was pink for being British, but when the lower classes often did not even have the money to remove the dead from their hovels. Balzac describes the equivalent of a French life of the period the class system, the political maneuvering behind the scenes, the inescapable the forces that made change impossible. But let me not drift away from this subject. I would, however, suggest, among Balzac's copious literary production, the novel Lost Illusions, Illusions Perdues, that described the attempt and the final defeat of a middle-class young man whose ambition was to become someone that counts. Back to Louis Philippe. The contingent events and factors that eventually brought the monarchy down, yet through another very bloody revolutions, were not in order of importance as follows. An incident in the faraway island of Tahiti, where France had to pay an indemnity to England because British missionaries had converted most of the population to Protestantism, whereupon Queen Pomaré expelled the Catholic priests, which in turn triggered a Franco-Tahitian war. A second other cause, England had forced France to make peace with the Sultan of Morocco, England being concerned about growing French influence in Africa. And there was turmoil in Europe. These were the times during which Italian nationalists were preparing Italy's independence as a united country, and this went against the policies of Austria, and King Louis Philippe did not want to antagonize Austria by answering the demands of the Italian patriots or revolutionaries, depending on how you wish to call them. There was corruption, like then, like now, we could say. There were actresses who were bargaining for privileges with deputies, while the gossip sheets of the time, like then, like now, supplied the credulous public. They supplied it with the usual fodder of sex and intrigue. There were conflicts with the educational establishments, with the lay universities being atheistic, in conflict with religious schools. There were bad crops, an increase in food prices, and finally Louis Philippe, now in his 70s, instead of becoming more liberal, was becoming more authoritarian. Still, all in all, Louis Philippe had afforded France some of the happiest years in her history, but, as the French historians said, the French do not live on happiness. In February 1848, there was a demonstration in front of the house of Guillaume Guizot, a brilliant historian, a statesman, and an orator, accused of being too favorable to the alleged conservative policies of the king. One of the demonstrators fired a pistol, the soldiery replied in kind, 20 people were killed, and the 1848 revolution started. King Louis Philippe abdicated in favor of his 9-year-old grandson, also called Philippe, Count of Paris. Fearful of what had happened to the deposed Louis XVI, Louis Philippe quickly left Paris under a disguise. Unlike Louis XVI, who attempted to escape France in extravagant transportation, Louis Philippe instead rode in an ordinary cab under the name of Mr. Smith. He fled to England and spent his final years incognito as the Comte de Neuilly. It was no doubt a good idea. During his 18 years of reign, he had survived 7 assassination attempts, and better not to strain luck too hard. Among these defenders was Victor Hugo, who, though a Republican, was taken in by the figure of this king and admired him. And I will quote him directly from Les Miserables. Louis Philippe had to bear in his own person the contradiction of the Restoration and of the Revolution, to have that disquieting side of the revolutionary which becomes reassuring in governing power. He had been proscribed, a wanderer, a poor. He had lived by his own labor. In Switzerland, this heir of the richest princely domains in France had sold an old horse in order to obtain bread. At Reichenau in Germany, he gave lessons in mathematics. These almost bourgeois souvenirs connected with the king rendered the bourgeoisie enthusiastic. He had, with his own hands, demolished the iron cage, the infamous prison at Mont Saint-Michel, built in the 1400s. What is there against him? The throne. Take away Louis Philippe the king, there remains the man. And the man is good. He is good at times, even to the point of being admirable. The National Assembly of France initially planned to accept young Philip as king, but the strong current of public opinion rejected that. On 26th of February 1848, the Second Republic was proclaimed. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was elected president on the 10th of December 1848, and on the 2nd of December 1851 he declared himself president for life and eventually later Emperor Napoleon III in 1852. We will discuss the 1848 revolution and the metamorphosis of Louis Bonaparte from a Republican president to an emperor in the next episode. We will conclude here telling something about him. He was the son of a brother of Napoleon, Louis Bonaparte, and of the beautiful Hortense de Beauharnais, who in turn was the daughter of the original Napoleon's first wife, Josephine Beauharnais, from Josephine's previous marriage, before marrying Napoleon, that is. Hortense de Beauharnais would deserve an episode all for her, but here we deal with her son, Louis Napoleon, later Napoleon III. Napoleon II was emperor for a few weeks at the age of 4, while his father Napoleon was getting ready to be defeated at Waterloo. After that, Napoleon III went to live in Austria, the country of his mother Empress Marie-Louise, or rather now ex-Empress Marie-Louise. Many names, many events, many upheavals, revolutions, political and industrial, 3 kings, and endless intrigues. But, as Shakespeare would say, the wheel is come full circle, and it always eventually does. Thank you for watching. Until next time, I am Jim Emolia for Historical Sketches. Good night.